Why hello there viewer, and welcome to my little video. Fullmetal Alchemist Brotherhood is a modern classic by any metric, resulting in its unsurprisingly comfortable sitting at the top of the scored anime rankings on my anime list at the time of this video. You would think with such a claim that the show's consistent level of quality from beginning to end would be self-evident. However, with such popularity always comes the detractors trying to tear it down. A lot of it typically directed toward the show's earlier episodes, but today, we're going to take a look at a handful of the criticisms directed towards the show's finale, and I'll be doing my best to address these complaints that these self-identifying critics have to levy against the show. So without further ado, why doesn't Mei Chang just throw her needles next to Father and just use her alchemy to move the ground, the most basic type of combat alchemy, to either catapult Father away from Ed, physically trap Father, or just attack Father in ways that would force him to have to defend himself instead of going for Edward? So I see the point being made here, but I don't really think it's a problem because with this scene, we got to really see how much Al cares for Ed and to what length Al is ready to go in order to protect his brother. Also, Al's sacrifice sets up for Ed's sacrifice coming in the next scene. So if Al hadn't sacrificed himself here, we'd be missing out on a lot of what makes the finale hit so hard. Number 2. Why does no one standing around try to help Ed? If it's because they're too tired to do a single thing, then how did they even have the energy to gather around, and how are they all able to cheer on Ed so enthusiastically once he starts beating up Father? Could not a single soldier muster the energy to pick up a gun, to shoot Father, to at least try to stop him? So when it comes to a story like Brotherhood, usually you need to have it so that the protagonist is the one who's defeating the antagonist. Otherwise, setting up the protagonist of the story, he doesn't really get to fulfill one of the main purposes of a protagonist, as it relates to the antagonist. Also, there's this parallel being drawn in this fight, which is that Truth decides to punish Father later on because Father, at the expense of people, tries to pursue perfection. But Ed, at the end, tells Truth that he sees the value of people. So having Ed confront Father in a direct fight, and Ed being the one to beat Father, plays into the theme and how there are parallels of one another. Number 3. How is Ed persuading Truth to change the most important law of alchemy, equivalent exchange, not a literal deus ex machina? This is not a plot hole, but an extreme contrivance that is foundational to allowing Ed to save Al while recovering his body by having God solve the plot for him. Just like in the plays where the term deus ex machina arises from, where the Greek god would intervene on behalf of the protagonist, rescuing him from a seemingly unsolvable dilemma or other conundrum using his or her divine power. Now, I've seen this point discussed quite frequently online, and a lot of people will say that Truth is actually not changing the laws of equivalency, but that Ed's trade was actually equivalent. But I don't think that can really be the case for a number of reasons. Number 1, if Ed was trying to make an equivalent exchange, why would he spend his conversation with Truth downplaying the value of the gate unless it was to highlight his character growth, which is what Ed increases the value of when he decreases the value of his gate. 2. How does one gate equal one alchemist? You know, an alchemist being one gate of their own plus one whole body plus one whole soul. There's nothing really to establish that up to that point. Also, if one gate equals one person, wouldn't that imply that an alchemist is twice as valuable as a non-alchemist? And wouldn't that go against the thematic point of the finale, where he says that he's always just been an ordinary human? 3. Why does Ed wait for Truth to tell him, quote, "Correct, alchemist, you've defeated me, take everything you want"? Not all necessarily imply that Truth allowing Ed to make the trade is contingent in order for Ed to go ahead and make the trade. Not to mention earlier on when Truth laughs at Ed, we're reminded of the adversarial relationship that Ed and Truth have. So if Truth was laughing at Ed, wouldn't it make sense that someone as prideful as Ed would go ahead with the transmutation just after Truth started laughing at him just to prove Truth wrong? Next, Ed actually leaves his leg behind, despite Truth saying that he could take anything he wanted. So if Ed's gate is supposed to be worth not only Al, but also Ed's leg on top of that, but Ed didn't take his leg, then there was not an equivalent exchange. That's not what equivalency means, so he couldn't have made that trade unless equivalency was not a factor. Then you also have, why does Ed get so excited when he answers Truth's final question before Truth declares him to be correct? If Truth had nothing to do with it, then why does Ed care so much before he goes on with the transmutation? And as a last point, in the manga, so take it for what you will, how can Mustang think that his gate would be equivalent for his eyesight if Ed's exchange was meant to be equivalent despite trading for a whole person with eyesight? so I don't really find that to be plausible. I think the scene makes it clear that Truth does amend the laws of alchemy in order to allow Ed to get Al back. However, it doesn't really bother me because this is a reward for his growth as a character. Like I just mentioned, the parallel with Father, where Truth punishes Father because Father doesn't see the value in people, whereas Ed very much values people. But also, even if it weren't for that, after all Ed and Al have done to get their bodies back and even to save the world, they deserve to be together. So to say it's a Deus Ex Machina to imply that they didn't deserve this, I think is disingenuous. And then finally, the scene was so good. The music, the cinematography, all of that was on point. It really delivered where it needed to emotionally regardless. Next, how can Ed claim he was wrong and arrogant to believe alchemy could solve his problems when Ed uses alchemy twice to solve the main problem of getting Al back? Those 2 times being when Ed draws the transmutation circle in central and claps his hands, transmuting himself, and the second time when he claps his hands and touches his gate, transmuting it away. Okay, so I actually think this is a legitimate criticism because it does seem kind of hypocritical because he's using alchemy to solve his foundational problem while saying that he doesn't need alchemy to solve his problems. Number 5. Where is Ed's character arc throughout the series of him overcoming his aforementioned arrogant belief in alchemy to solve his problems? By the way, Ed says his arrogance about alchemy came after seeing the truth, not before. So what I think this is alluding to is Ed's arrogance displayed generally throughout the runtime of the show. And this arc comes to its resolution when Ed admits at the end that he was just an ordinary human who couldn't save a little girl. Now, I could say, given that this is one of the big reasons why Truth allows Ed to violate the law of equivalent exchange, more focus and more time would have been nice to have for this particular character arc of Ed, but I think it's a nitpick and not really needed, though it would have been nice. Number 6. Where is Ed's character arc of him seeing value in relying on people / his friends as opposed to presumably just alchemy, especially when he's seen the value of relying on people for his whole journey, such as relying on his brother, Winry and Grandma for automail, Izumi for teaching alchemy, Mustang for military-related support, etc. So I would say my answer is relatively the same for the last question, where generally we see that Ed's pretty arrogant and that he likes to do things his own way, and it would be nice if more time was dedicated to fleshing out this as an arc particularly, rather than just a characteristic of Ed. But Ed is meant to be fairly static throughout the show, so because he's meant to be that way, it doesn't really bother me that much. Number 7. If Ed gets so mad at Hohenheim for suggesting to use his stone to bring Al back because it would consume the lives of those trapped in the stone, then why did Ed have no problem with Ling using the stone to become Emperor of Jing? Well, I guess Ed's just tolerant. I guess he's not really tolerant of what Hohenheim wants to do, but that's kind of the point of Brotherhood, where you get all these people with diverse perspectives together, and they can, despite their differences, tolerate the differences between one another and work together for the greater good. Number 8. Why does Ed have no problem using alchemy at all after he learns that the energy for his alchemy comes from the, quote, Philosopher's Stone energy being fed through a nationwide network of underground tubes from Father's body in the earth between the surface and the crust to act as a barrier between Amestrian alchemists and true energy? I think this quote comes from the FMA Wikipedia page. Is this really the case? Because if it is, maybe that's a problem, but I'll reserve judgment on this. This is the kind of complex world building that Brotherhood engages in that I'm not really that much of an expert of, but even so, both the whole Ling becoming Emperor and Father using the alchemy in the Earth's crust or whatever, these are such minor plot points that it doesn't detract from the larger story in any meaningful way, I don't think. At least for me. And finally, doesn't Mustang being able to get his sight back with Marco's stone significantly undermine the sacrifices Mustang had to make along the way? Yeah, I would agree that the ending is a little bit too happy for my taste, but I do think it is a nitpick. Because despite this, Mustang sacrificed a lot of time and effort trying to become the Führer, and in the end, as far as we know, he didn't. Well, thank you for stopping by this video. I hope that I demonstrated that Fullmetal Alchemist Brotherhood truly does stand the test of time as one of the best anime to have ever been produced, and I hope you'll comment, subscribe, and smash that bloody like button if you enjoyed, or would like to see similar content in the future.